Hello. So we're going to start. Welcome to everyone who has joined today's seminar on the likely prevalence of occupational noise-induced hearing loss in Britain. I'm Dr. Mary Traynor and I'm Head of Science Impact and Quality at the Health and Safety Executive. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce our speakers. John Cherry is Emeritus Professor of Human Health at Heriot-Watt University, and he's also former Research Director at the Institute of Occupational Medicine in Edinburgh. Dr. Paul Litchfield is Visiting Professor to Coventry University, and he's also Independent Chief Medical Advisor to ITV and Compass Group. So, both of our speakers today are members of the Workplace Health Excellence Committee, and I thought I'd start by saying a few words about this. So the development of policy within HSE needs to be informed by best available contemporary scientific evidence. And HSE formed the Workplace Health Expert Committee, also known as WHEC, in 2015 to provide independent expert advice to them. And the topics they cover are new and emerging workplace health issues, new and emerging evidence relating to existing workplace health issues, the quality and relevance of the evidence base on workplace issues. So today we're looking at noise-induced hearing loss, and it's something where we know very little about the current prevalence. And in particular, much has changed in British workplaces over recent time, particularly in relation to better noise control measures that are used in workplaces and far more extensive use of hearing protectors. However, we're also very, very aware that there are also new sources of noise. So things like the use of telephone headsets in call centres or in-ear devices which are used by emergency responders. So because of this, HSE asked the members of the Workplace Health Expert Committee to provide us with a better understanding of the likely prevalence, both current and future, of occupational noise-induced hearing loss across British industry. So before our two speakers start, I'd like to let you know that we will be recording the seminar, just what our speakers say, so that it is available afterwards. And then immediately after that, we'll stop the recording and we will have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions for either of our speakers, please put them into the Q&A tab within Teams. And the Q&A tab also allows voting on the questions. And in particular, given the size of the audience we have today, it would be really helpful for us if you could use that voting tab so that we can take the most popular questions first. So please post your questions as we go through the seminar and we will take them at the end. So I will now hand over to Professor John Cherry as our first speaker.
Well, thanks, Mary. I think I'll kick off first, if that's okay. Good afternoon, everybody. I hope people can see that, Mary. If not, please shout at me.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Right, okay. So as Mary says, what we'll aim to do today is outline the key elements of the report that WHEC produced earlier this year into the likely prevalence of noise-induced hearing loss, what I'll refer to most of the time as NIHL, across British industry. And over the next half hour, what John and I will aim to do is cover off what HSE already knows about noise-induced hearing loss, talk a bit about noise-induced hearing loss, and the problems in assessing its prevalence in industry, some of the factors that can influence NIHL, then what the published research shows, what we can say from the evidence that we've been able to review, and then looking forward, how we might try to estimate rather better the prevalence of NIHL in the coming years. So where are we at the moment? Well, the two sources that HSE uses predominantly to try and determine how much noise-induced hearing loss there is in the workplace is use of the labour force survey and industrial injuries disablement benefit. Now, the labour force survey, as many of you will know, is a large survey, but it's self-reported data. In other words, it's what people say, it's subjective, it's their own responses, it's not objective in any way. But on the basis of that, what we can see is that in the period 2018-19 to 2020-21, there were around about 14,000 workers who said that they were suffering from new or long-standing NIHL. Now, since, as with everything, that every report you write is, of course, out of date the minute it's published. So the figures that have come along just in the last couple of months show that figure to be around 11,000. But it gives you an idea of the sort of scale from that data source. The other main source, as I say, that HSE relies upon is IIDB. Now, in 2019, there were 95 new awards for occupational deafness, compared to 10 years previously, when there were more than double that figure. Now, in 2021, the figure was way down at 10, but of course that's almost certainly pandemic influenced. But the trend appears to be a diminishing number of IIDB awards. Now, to get an IIDB award is actually quite difficult. That's partly because the amount of hearing loss that you need to have is very significant, a 50 decibel loss, at least 50 decibel loss in both ears. And it's also restricted to specified work situations, as with the other awards that IIDB covers. So things like quarrying would be covered, but many other types of work which we might think of as noisy wouldn't necessarily be covered. The other thing which HSE, the other source that HSE has referred to in the past in trying to determine prevalence is a report written for the Medical Research Council back in the late 1990s by Keith Palmer and colleagues. And there, that was again a self-reported survey, but that came up with a prevalence at that time of over 480,000 people in the workforce with either hearing loss or tinnitus that was attributed to noise at work. So as you can see, quite a variation in numbers, even with those standard sources that HSE has used for some time. So we thought about what other sources we might be able to tap into. One of the ones we looked at was personal injury claims. That's where people take out a civil claim against their employer for personal injury, and the Association of British Insurers used to publish regular reports on the number of claims that have been made and settled. And the last report that they published was back in 2014, and in that year more than 15,000 claims for occupational noise-induced hearing loss were settled, which had come down a lot from 20 years previously, when there were around about 30,000 claims settled. Now, in the past 10 years, it's got more difficult because 10 years ago, the system changed, the legal system changed. So most claims now, claims under £25,000, are made through the claims portal, and you can get access to that data, but it's much more difficult and really not as straightforward as it was when ABI were doing the data collection. The other thing to say about that data is that it tends to be a bit volatile. So one sees year on year that the numbers can change quite a bit. And at least part of that is due to what is known as claims farming. That's where firms of solicitors go out, they target specific occupational populations, might be miners, might be telephone engineers, might be some other group, and actively recruit people to make a claim against their employer. So that tends to distort the figures, although over a long period of time that will settle out. The other source that we looked at were the clinical reporting schemes. Now, the best known of those is OPRA, administered by Manchester University. That is an occupational physician reporting scheme. And the other one of relevance in this area is OSA, which is a similar scheme for audiological physicians. And in the period 98 to 2006, through those schemes, there were over 4,700 reports of work-related hearing loss or tinnitus. And looking at the two schemes, OPRA gave an incidence of just under 8 per 100,000 employees. OSA, a much smaller incidence estimate of 0.8 per 100,000. Now, the OPRA number has dropped in more recent years, and OSA stopped operating altogether in 2006. But what those reports show consistently is that there's a higher incidence of noise-induced hearing loss in older males and people working in certain sectors, in particular public administration, defence and manufacture of metals. And as Mary said in the introduction, all of that, of course, all those numbers are set against a changing landscape. What people do for a living is changing all the time and has changed quite significantly over the last 30 years. We undoubtedly have better noise control than we used to have 30 years ago in noisy industries. But as Mary also said, we're also seeing new sources of noise, in particular headsets, where the data really isn't clear about what the impact is in relation to noise-induced hearing loss. So what types of hearing loss are we talking about? Well, there are two main categories: conductive hearing loss and sensory neural hearing loss. And very quickly, the simple, which is the only sort I can understand, guide to the anatomy and physiology. So when a noise occurs, the ear, the pinna, the external ear, picks up that noise, directs it into the ear canal. That external ear and ear canal will tend to magnify, amplify the noise to some extent. The pressure of the sound wave hits the tympanic membrane, the eardrum. That sets off a vibration in the three small bones in the middle ear, which then in turn transmit that vibration to another membrane between the middle ear and the inner ear, and that causes fluid in the cochlea. That's the thing that looks like a snail on the diagram, causes the fluid in there to move, which disturbs little hairs sitting within that cavity. Those in turn generate electrical impulses which pass through the acoustic nerve and are perceived by the brain as being sound. So that's the mechanism. Now, clearly, a conductive loss is one that interferes with the noise pressure being transmitted, and that can be something as simple as wax in the outer ear or an infection in the middle ear. Sensory neural loss affects the inner ear, and that's where there's a problem either with the hairs, the little cilia within the cochlea, or with the nerve endings that are translating the movement of those little hairs into electrical impulses. And quite often one sees a mix, so a mix of both conductive and sensory neural loss. So what are the causes of hearing loss generally, not necessarily related to work? Well, far and away the commonest cause of deafness is simply the passage of time, getting older, presbyacusis, as we call it. It's extremely common. If you reach the age of 60, then more than 25% of us will have some element of presbyacusis, age-related hearing loss. And if we get as far as the age of 90, almost everybody will have some age-related hearing loss. There are genetic differences, so men are more affected than women, and it appears that white races are more likely to exhibit hearing loss than Afro-Caribbeans. The hearing loss you get with presbyacusis tends to occur equally on both sides, and it's predominantly high frequency. So the lower frequencies are pretty well maintained, but you lose the higher frequencies, and it's caused by the hair cells within the cochlea, that thing looked like a snail, deteriorating, and also the fibers that transmit the movement from those hairs into the nerve, those fibers degenerating, and that's what causes the age-related hearing loss. The practical impact is that it causes difficulty in discriminating speech. So you know that somebody has said something, but you can't pick out what it is that they're saying. And the reason for that, as I said, is that low frequencies are pretty well maintained, and vowels are lower frequency noises. So a, o, u, the vowels in our speech are quite low pitch, whereas the consonants, the p, the t, the s, are much higher pitch. So you hear the noise, but you can't discriminate and pick out the consonants that tell you what that noise is saying. Apart from age-related hearing loss, deafness can be caused by a number of other things, including illness, infections. Otosclerosis is a deterioration of those little bones in the ear, or Meniere's disease, which is a disease of the inner ear, not particularly well understood, but may have something to do with problems with the liquid within the cochlea, within that thing that looks like a snail. Some medication can cause deafness. Some antibiotics, notably gentamicin, will cause or can cause deafness. So can some painkillers and some cancer drugs. In the workplace, there are a number of things a number of chemicals that people can be exposed to that can cause deafness. Some solvents, including some common solvents like toluene and styrene. Metals like lead and mercury can cause deafness, and also pesticides, not just organophosphorus pesticides, but also pyrethroids can cause toxicity to the ear and therefore deafness. And then trauma and tumours can cause deafness too, and that can be a simple head injury, or it can be in things like diving or aviation, trauma from rapid changes in pressure, barotrauma, that can either rupture the eardrum or disrupt the bones within the ear. And then there are certain tumours. The most notable one is a thing called acoustic neuroma, which is a specific benign tumour of the acoustic nerve, but even though it's benign, it causes profound deafness. What we're interested in, though, is noise-induced hearing loss, and there are two ways of becoming deaf as a result of noise. One is very high volume sounds, impulse noise, things like explosions, artillery fire, where the level of noise, the pressure that's exerted on the ear is so high that it causes a physical rupture of the eardrum or damages those little bones in the middle ear. That's not, fortunately, terribly common. What we see much more commonly is repeated noise exposure causing deafness, and that's thought to be caused, rather like presbyacusis, by damage to those little hair cells in the inner ear, and eventually those little hair cells will die, and that produces the deafness. The other thing that you can see is what's called a temporary threshold shift. In other words, exposure to a loud noise causes temporary deafness. Many of us might have experienced that if we've been to a rock concert. You come out after an hour or two in the concert and you find that you're shouting at your friends to try and make each other understood because you've got a temporary deafness. But over the course of the next few hours, overnight, that deafness will resolve and your hearing will be back to normal. So what we see with that repeated noise exposure, the commonest type of noise-induced hearing loss, is a sensory neural deafness. So as I say, it's related to damage to those little hair cells. It's usually on both sides, unless the noise source that you're exposed to has over a prolonged period been on one side only. And when you look at the audiogram, and that's what the picture is on the slide there, you see a characteristic 4 kilohertz notch. Now, a standard audiogram will measure hearing loss between around about 250 hertz up to around about 8,000 hertz. And if you look at the graph there, you can see those frequencies running along the x-axis, and on the y-axis you see the amount of decibel loss. And it's generally accepted that anything up to about 20 decibels is within the normal range. So in this case, the tracing here, you can see that up to 2 kilohertz, it's trundling along at a pretty normal level. It then dips down at 3 kilohertz, 4 kilohertz, and then comes up again at 6 and 8 kilohertz in both the left ear, which is the crosses, and the right ear, which is the circles. And that is a characteristic picture of noise-induced hearing loss. So audiometry is key to the diagnosis of any sort of hearing loss, but in particular occupational hearing loss. And as many of you will know, the way you conduct an audiogram is you put somebody into an acoustic booth and you put headphones on their ears, you expose them to the noise at those different frequencies at differing levels, and you ask them to press a button when they hear the noise and release it when they don't hear it, or the other way around. And that then records the tracing that we saw on the previous slide. Key points to make are that, of course, audiometry is measuring all hearing loss and not just occupational noise-induced hearing loss. So you're picking out all the hearing loss. The audiometry of itself can't pick out whether it's due to noise or not. Noise-induced hearing loss can be due to workplace noise, but it can also be due to non-occupational noise. If you're a roadie on those rock concerts that I was talking about, then that would be occupational noise. But if you're just a fan that goes every night because you like the band so much, it's non-occupational. Either way, you're going to expose the noise and it may deafen you. And as I said, presbyacusis also affects particularly those high frequencies. So you frequently see in older people a mix of both age-related hearing loss and also occupational hearing loss, and it can be very difficult to pick out one from the other. And at that point, I would like to hand over to John.
Thank you. I think you need to, oh, that's me.
I think you need to ask to be given the controls. There we are.
Just done that. Lovely.
And I would hope that I have given it to you, John.
Thank you, Paul. So let's just remind ourselves of the question then that WHEC was asked. So we were asked to provide advice to HSC about the the prevalence, likely prevalence of occupational noise-induced hearing loss across British industry. And they want to know this both today, but also how that might change in the future. And they want to have that information for all industry groups and all job titles. And they want to understand why there might be differences between groups of workers by industry or job. So as you can understand, this is really quite an ambitious question that WHEC were faced with. And so we agreed that we would set about this by looking at the available published information and reviewing that, and then taking stock of what that told us and providing some advice to HSE about what we thought a way forward would be. Okay, so before we get too far into all of this, we've already been talking about incidence and prevalence, and I thought it might be useful just to think a little bit about what we mean by these. And the analogy that's often used as to explain these terms is the bathtub. So in this case, the prevalence of disease in society is represented by the water in the bathtub, the amount of water in the tub, and incidence is the additional water that's coming into the tub through the spray. So the level of water in the tub can rise if there's increased incidence, although it can go down as well because there's loss mechanisms that may occur. People may die, and that's represented here by leakage from the tub through the drain or other means, or they may recover, which we see is represented by evaporation of the liquid. So in terms of noise and hearing loss, then we've really got maybe to think a little bit more about this. The prevalence would be the amount of hearing loss in society, in the whole of society. And incidence would be new cases of hearing loss that were diagnosed in a period of time, perhaps over a year or whatever. And it's, as Paul has been suggesting, it's rather more complicated than that in some ways, because the question we are being asked is not what is the prevalence of hearing loss in society, but what is the prevalence of occupational noise-induced hearing loss in society. And in our analogy, we might represent that by thinking of having two liquids in our bathtub, some oil and some water, and that the level of oil in the tub represents the occupational noise-induced hearing loss, and the water represents the age-related and other causes of hearing loss in society. And the incidence would contain a mixture of oil and water, which would then partition into the two parts as they go on. Now, the problem we have is that audiometry, as Paul again has said, only allows us to look at hearing loss and doesn't really allow us to determine what the cause of that is. And that's really a major stumbling block in terms of understanding what's known about this problem. I think there's two other aspects that we need to understand about prevalence in relation to noise-induced hearing loss, and that is that it's age-related. So both the occupational and the age-related causes of or components of hearing loss are likely to be related to how old the individual is. And the occupational part is because as you get older, you've accumulated more exposure, and so the risk is greater for older people. And it will also differ by sex. So just looking at a subset of your liquid in your bathtub, you need to understand whether or not the distribution of age and sex within that is representative of the whole. And again, that's not always the case in studies. So noise is an important cause of hearing loss, both occupational noise and other sources of noise, non-occupational noise coming from various entertainment sources or other sources that we might find in our lives. And we can characterize the noise that we're exposed to by its intensity and its frequency. And both components affect the risk of hearing loss. And it's common to combine these together in terms of intensity by weighting the intensity for the frequency of noise that we're exposed to. And we use a specific weighting system called the A weighting, which represents the mid-frequencies where hearing loss is more likely to occur. And so when we talk about intensity, we often talk about dBA, that's A-weighted noise level and decibels. And the other important factor, of course, as Paul has indicated, is the duration, the impulsive characteristics of the sound, because very short duration sounds have a much more impactful effect on hearing than do continuous noise. And of course, all of these things are dependent on the duration, the overall duration in years that the individual may have for their own risk of hearing loss. Now, decibels are a rather odd scale. They're not a scale in terms of physical units. They're, in fact, a ratio of the noise level in relation to some reference level. And they're expressed on a logarithmic scale, which means that small changes in decibels actually can represent much larger changes in the actual intensity and the harmfulness of the noise. So every 3 decibel increase in noise level represents a doubling of the harm that noise might cause. And of course, a halving of the decibel level reduces the risk correspondingly. But that means we need to think about noise in a very different way from other risks in the workplace, because when we talk about noise levels, and somebody says, oh, it's only 83, it's just a little bit less than 85, then that actually is quite a substantial reduction in the risk in practice. So it's relatively easy to measure noise levels, and given that fact, it's surprising in some ways that we don't have a nationally representative data set of noise levels in British industry. It doesn't exist. In fact, I don't think it exists anywhere in the world, that kind of data set, which is representative of all the exposures that people get in industry. Some people have tried, so this paper that we refer to here by Cheng and colleagues from the USA analysed almost 750,000 measurements of noise level across nearly 260 occupations. And these showed, a fairly interesting picture. And the reason that the authors were doing this was not just to understand the noise level, but was to try and see, could they use the job title information as a proxy for the noise level that people were exposed to. They wanted to construct what's known as a job exposure matrix. Well, what they found was that most occupations had quite a reasonable amount of heterogeneity within them in terms of noise level. So there was considerable variation between different people doing the same job. But about half of the occupations that they had data for had noise levels above 85 dBA. Excuse me. We can see a little bit more of their data in the following plot. So this shows a representation of some of the aggregated job titles along the bottom axis, and then each dot represents the mean exposure for that job title from the measurements. And you can see that ranges from at the bottom end, construction supervisors, office workers and others, up to at the top end, logging workers and woodworkers and others. You have to accept that there is, considerable variation across the jobs here, which is the important thing from their point of view. It's likely that these jobs at the lower end are biased upwards, because you remember these are data which already exist. So somebody had to think there was a point in measuring the noise level, and so they had to think there was at least some possibility that the noise might be causing harm, and that's I think likely to mean that office workers aren't really exposed to just below 80 dBA, but actually probably have lesser exposure. Another interesting observation from the Cheng data analysis was the temporal analysis. They had data from 1968 up to 2014. And when they looked at that over time, what they saw was a fairly consistent reduction in the average exposure as time went on. And the early measurements, and again, they're likely to be fairly sparse data sets, but they're all pretty much above 90 decibels on average. But as soon as you get into the late 70s and onwards, there's a consistent, almost, well, on average, they say 0.3 of a decibel each year reduction in the average exposure. And this is an observation that's been echoed in other studies, that noise exposure is decreasing, and is decreasing by a fairly steady, impressive amount. Now, noise causes hearing loss. That's a fairly uncontroversial statement, but what we really would like to understand a little bit better is the relationship between the noise exposure and the hearing loss, and that has been codified in the in an international standard 1999, and the plot there shows an example of the predictions that this model can make. Now that graph looks very much like the audiogram that Paul showed later. The horizontal axis is frequency of sound, and the vertical is the permanent threshold shift that might occur. But it's not an audiogram, it's a prediction of the noise that might, the hearing loss that might occur from noise exposure. And the data here is for a specific example of men aged 60 who've had 40 years exposure to really quite a high level of noise, 90 dBA. And there are three sets of lines in the plot. The black lines represent the 95th percentile of the distribution, the blue lines the median, the 50th percentile, and the red lines are the 5th percentile. So you can see there's quite a lot of difference between the people who are most affected by the noise, that's the red lines, and those who are least affected, that's the black lines. So not everybody gets the same effects on their hearing as everyone else. But the other thing to look at is that for each of the colours there are two lines. So the X's represent just that portion of the hearing loss which is attributable to age, and the zeros ones represent age plus the noise exposure. And so the second important thing to note is that the effect of noise exposure in relation to age-related hearing loss is relatively small, and that even for the median hearing loss, it's something like a 10 decibel further reduction, but against a background of age-related hearing loss causing between 20 and 30 decibel reduction. So noise is not the most important cause of hearing loss in society, even for people who have had, as we see here, quite high exposure over a long period of time. So in our review then, we set out to try and figure out what might have been happening to prevalence over the last 40 years. And we looked at this in relation to three groups of factors that we thought might influence the noise-induced hearing loss prevalence. Factors related to the workplace and the noise exposure in workplace, co-exposures that might modify the effect of noise, and non-occupational factors that might influence hearing loss, such as recreational noise exposure. And well, we came up with a relatively short list of potential factors. I'll make that a little bit bigger so you can see it more easily. Yeah, we have a relatively short list of factors that we thought might be important. And what we've tried to do is, in thinking about what information we had, whether or not the prevalence might have changed and decreased over the last 40 years, may it have increased, or do we have insufficient information to really decide one or the other? Now, the first three items on our list are all to do with noise exposure in the workplace. So either introducing noise controls, changing the machinery to provide more quieter machinery, or encouraging the use of hearing protectors in the workplace. And all of these three factors we thought over the last 40 years would have reduced the prevalence of noise-induced hearing loss. The next four items are all to do with employment trends, the reductions in the number of workers in traditional noisy industries, that representing the decline of shipbuilding and other similar types of industry in Britain. Fewer people with military service, and both of those factors we thought would decrease prevalence. And then the other two employment trend factors we thought might increase prevalence. And these are more older people in the workforce and more people employed in call centres using or using headsets in other situations. And then we've got two items there that relate to impulsive noise. So, and we thought that certainly impulsive noise in traditional industries would have been decreasing over this time. Acoustic shock from wearing headsets, we weren't sure, but we acknowledged that modern headsets have noise limiting technology to reduce the effects of acoustic shock. And then the last two items on our list are toxic chemicals that Paul described that may damage hearing, and cigarette smoking, which also is known to damage hearing. Well, you can see, just looking at the right-hand side of the table, that most of our arrows show downward tendency and prevalence over time, and broadly, that's our position, that we think that prevalence will have decreased over the last 40 years. So we set about to review the published literature, and we did this systematically, although we didn't do a systematic literature review in the sense that scientific literature reviews might be carried out. We identified about 30 or 40 papers in recent years that we thought might be informative, and we summarised the main ones of those in the report that we produced. And yeah, I've just picked out three of these to really highlight. And the first one I think is really potentially quite important for us, because the Lai et al. Paper carried out a systematic review, so a proper scientific review, to review the occupational noise-induced hearing loss. They found 96 papers, and most of their papers were based on audiometry. The quality of the studies wasn't good, and part of the problem with that is the issue about audiometry only assessing hearing loss, not noise-induced hearing loss, not occupational noise-induced hearing loss, and then disentangling the effects of the occupational components from the other causes of hearing loss, which most studies just don't attempt to do, and that's really a problem. But at the end of the day, they concluded that somewhere between 7 and 21% of hearing loss amongst workers was caused by their work, and that they thought that in industrialized countries it was probably more likely to be nearer 7% than 21%. They also concluded that the prevalence of hearing loss, noise-induced hearing loss, would have decreased over the recent years. The second paper was not a single paper, but it's a group of papers that summarise hearing loss were from the US NIHL government agency, and they looked at prevalence of hearing loss in various industry sectors. Again, it's just audiometry, so it doesn't partition out the age-related part, but they did it in different industries, so they were able to show that, for example, hearing loss in mining, there was 27% of workers in the mining industry were suffering from hearing loss, whereas only about 8% of couriers and messengers were similarly affected. And then the final paper that we want to highlight is Walhagen, which is another American study. This is interesting because it's a prospective study, so they followed up a group of individuals over 30 years, and a relatively small number of people, about 5,000 people, but still enough to get some interesting findings. So interesting in those respects, but it's only self-reported hearing loss. So they just asked the people, do you have difficulty hearing? And so it's subjective in that respect. And they don't have any data about the noise exposure that the individuals had. So they, again, just asked what jobs the people did, and then they categorized their exposure in terms of that. But interestingly, they found an increase in hearing prevalence over the hearing loss over the 30 years that they followed the people up. But that's not surprising because they're getting older as they're followed up, and so you would expect the prevalence to increase. But they also did find greater levels of hearing loss in people who were employed in jobs that might have had high noise exposure. So what did we conclude? Most of these studies are not carried out in the UK. As you saw, there's a lot of evidence that comes from the USA or from other parts of the world, and it's not so much directly relevant to British industry. There's a problem with most of the studies because they don't assess occupational noise-induced hearing loss. They assess hearing loss, and then they try to figure out by either looking at job titles or other things whether or not that might be occupationally related. But it's far from ideal to be trying to do that. Generally poor quality data, and that's yeah, I'm being told I need to hurry up a little bit. So we concluded that around about 1/5 of the British workforce might be exposed to noise levels above 85 dBA, and that the prevalence of noise-induced hearing loss is likely to be much less than 10%. In fact, there's other data that's only recently been published that suggests that the noise-induced hearing loss levels, occupational noise-induced hearing loss levels in the UK might be substantially less than 10%, perhaps nearer 2%. And we concluded that the prevalence of noise-induced hearing loss has probably decreased over the last 40 years, and I think that's fairly uncontroversial. So what did we advise HSE? Well, we suggested that rather than go ahead and do some sort of direct research to measure this, we recommended a modelling study to try and model hearing loss and occupational noise-induced hearing loss for the British population. We recommended using the ISO 1999 standard, which we talked about earlier, which relates noise exposure to hearing loss. We recommended that there should be a noise job exposure matrix that would allow you to connect job title with potential exposure, and then that can be used in the ISO 99 framework to estimate the hearing loss. We consider, well, we suggested that there should be some systematic collection of noise exposure data from industry, and then the other elements that you need to have are available to make your estimate. In this way, we think you could directly answer the rather complex question that HSE posed to WHEC in a way that would provide some information. So I shan't go through the conclusions directly because of lack of time, but you can read them for yourselves. Thank you.
Well, many thanks to John and Paul. That was an enormously informative seminar. And I think what's really come across is how robust and how detailed and how much consideration you've put into it. And it is hugely valuable for HSE as the British regulator to have your robust advice. And for me personally, I think also the way that you have brought out the challenges in the data, the strength of evidence is really important, because that's what our policy colleagues really value as well in terms of informing HSE decisions on noise-induced hearing loss. So thank you very much indeed.